Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, HEC-TV, Boeing, and the Danforth Center are proud to present Conversations, a discussion with Ira Flatow, host of NPR's Science Friday.
I'd like to welcome you all. It's a wonderful turnout. I'm just delighted to see you all here. And we're in the AT&T auditorium here, which we're lucky to have. It's a great facility. And representing AT&T is one of our great St. Louisans, Deb Hollingsworth, and with her are two interns from Iraq. And I'd just like them to stand and be recognized. Thank you. Now, after my introductory remarks, we're going to have a format very much like our conversation series. Professor Jim Davis from Washington University will be quizzing our distinguished guest, and then open to questions later on. Everyone should have a card and a pencil when you came in that you can write down any questions you have, and then someone will come around and collect them. We hope the questions will all be in before 5:35, and that will allow Jim to be looking through and combine what should be combined. So I hope that that will work for everybody. And the conversation series are put on by our friends group, and I've heard today that we still have places for extra friends. So if any of you would like to join and support our endeavors here, why, feel free to. Yesterday, I had lunch with a young man from Tucson who was very talkative, very interested in everything. And he was going to leave in the afternoon, and his heart was broken because he wanted to be here in St. Louis when his greatest hero was going to be here in St. Louis. Now, you probably think I'm talking about President Obama, but his greatest hero is Ira Flatow. And I can see from this size of this audience that we have lots of Flatow groupies right here as well.
I would have said Bob Gibson.
So the audience here can be our Flatow groupies, despite any differences in political opinions. I'm grateful to Ira Flatow for being here, to KWMU and Tim Eby for making this all possible, for NPR, and for our two great friends, Connie and Dan Burkhart, for sort of paving the way for us. So thanks for making all this possible. For those who do not know, Ira Flatow was born in New York City. His first experience on TV news was in high school. He studied engineering at State University of New York at Buffalo and joined NPR in 1971. He, of course, as you know, is the heart and brains behind the very successful Science Friday. Since I still work on Fridays, I have to catch as I can in my car, and the only thing I would request was, please don't say anything interesting when I'm supposed to be parking.
I have to show you how to podcast Science Friday.
He is also an author, and his latest book is called Present at the Future, and you can, I'm sure, go home tonight and look it up on Amazon.com. I consider Ira Flatow and Science Friday to be national treasures. I say that because I believe that science will wither without public support and public understanding. And it isn't always easy to have public support and public understanding because science is unsettling to many, and I certainly hear from them. Discovery of any new realities changes our cherished beliefs, change our great beliefs, such as that the sun goes around the earth, that vaccination is a sin against God. In 1800, the president of Yale was opposed vaccinations because he said, if God had decreed that these children should die, let them die. And of course, that's a very logical approach. Vaccinations have been thought to be dangerous to health, and one of my first cousins would not inoculate her kids, which I consider to be a terrible thing because she's just trusting that everybody else will inoculate theirs and her kid won't have to be inoculated. It discloses that global warming is nothing. It overturns the belief of a few that global warming is nothing to worry about. That GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, are risky to planet Earth. But we shouldn't really dismiss these concerns about what science is uncovering, because they're natural. People mistrust what they don't understand. And this mistrust can have consequences. Mistrust can lead people to take foolish actions or fail to take actions that they should to protect their fellow human beings. Education, teaching people about science is important, but it doesn't, as we know, always do the trick because science is so hard to understand. But it's very important for people to hear someone talking about science in a non-threatening way, an interesting way, helping people to feel someone else's fascination with and excitement about science, and learning about the practical benefits in a factual way without hype. It allows interest to be awakened. It allows learning that science should not be feared. It's safe to learn more about this interesting subject, and that's what Ira Flatow does. People soon learn to trust him in ways that they don't always trust scientists or their institutions. And our center benefits greatly. In our recent report to the community, we adopted the slogan, "The right place at the right time." When we started this center 11 years ago, we were facing headwinds. Anti-genetically modified organism feeling, especially in Europe, but some of it here. Old-fashioned ways of managing science in the Department of Agriculture, little interest in the Department of Energy, traditions in Congress that said that really research grants should be more handouts, research should be funded more by handouts from Congress than by competitive grants, little interest in the great foundations. Now the wind is at our back. The whole attitude has changed. In Washington, we have a National Institute for Food and Agriculture with our founding president, Roger Beachy, as its founding director. The Department of Energy has recognized the importance of biofuels, and we're lead organization in a very large grant a lead organization in a 25-member consortium. Gates Foundation is supporting our work with cassava. Howard Hughes Institute is interested, and our opportunities to make great contributions have grown remarkably. And I think that we can give some of that credit to Ira Flatow. We'd like to give it all, of course, because we're so good, but the world just doesn't work that way. Someone has to educate people and tell them what's important, and I appreciate that. Now we'll turn this over to Professor Jim Davis. Jim, it's all yours.
Thanks, Bill. Well, let me join Dr. Danforth in welcoming this large crowd. I'm delighted to see so many of you here. It's testimony to the interest people have in science, I think, as well as testimony to the reputation that Ira Flatow has. Bill has introduced Ira at some length, and I will pass over that, but I would simply note that Ira Flatow is used to being the moderator or the interviewer, and for the next hour he gets to experience some role reversal. As I play the role of moderator and he's the subject. Bill mentioned briefly Ira's writing as well as his long career with NPR. I brought in a copy of Present at the Future, and I'll refer to it again in just a minute. I was delighted that we had it in Washington University Library. And
So am I.
quickly scanned. Yeah. On the other hand, if they hadn't had it in the library, I would have had to buy a copy, and you'd be
I'd give you one.
even
I'd give
more
one to the
delighted.
library.
We should have had a book signing upstairs,
There
I
you go.
suspect. But the book itself is very readable, conversational, began with a very good chapter on the human brain and memory, and that's a topic I'm increasingly interested in as mine fades. But not only that, it goes from computing to cosmology to science and religion. There are a lot of topics, all handled in a conversational, interesting, attractive way. It's a readable book, and I commend it all to you. I'll turn my copy in, and you all can
It's on Amazon
check it
in
out.
case you're interested.
Yeah.
Thank you for those words.
You know, I told Ira that the conversation this afternoon starts up here. Bill mentioned that. I have quite a few questions, but directly we'll be turning to the audience. My job will be to scan, to organize, occasionally to summarize the questions that come in, so that while the conversation starts here, it will quickly include as many of you as want to be included. And I'm looking forward to that part and your questions. Let me start with, as soon as I read this, I knew it was my introduction today. This is from the chapter Memory, Senior Jeopardy, anyone? And it's just a couple of lines I'm going to read. Forgetting things isn't all bad. I'm not rationalizing just because I've always had a rotten memory. I've even forgotten names of people I'm interviewing.
That's right, Bill.
While I'm interviewing them. Well, I was going to remind you, I'm Jim Davis, just for the record.
Well, let me do a Sarah Palin thing here.
And
right
you're-
now.
And you're,
I don't remember.
anyway.
Nice to be in Oklahoma. That's all I have to say.
Well, as an undergraduate, you studied engineering at SUNY Buffalo, and after graduation went immediately to work for NPR. Not everyone would see an obvious link between engineering and journalism. What led you to make what some would regard as an early career change?
Well, I was doing very poorly in engineering. And that was very motivational. And my girlfriend said, if you don't do something else, we're through. So and actually, as you mentioned, in high school, I was involved in television. I was on the technical side, and this is in the mid-'60s. We had one of the very few early TV stations in high school. It was a federal grant to do this. And I'd worked there for $1 an hour, minimum wage, federal grant. And so when I got into when I got into college at SUNY Buffalo studying engineering, they did not have a TV station. So I searched around for the closest thing to it, and that was the radio station. And I went in there wanting to work the dials and everything like I did in television. And at that time, the anti-war movement, the Vietnam anti-war movement, was rolling through town. The president of the university had gone from Berkeley to Chicago. Remember, they bombed the university in Chicago in the math department, and then he left there, and he came to Buffalo. And so the anti-war movement followed him across the country. And it was now in Buffalo, and the station had a staff meeting, and they asked for volunteers who wanted to learn how to become a reporter. I said, gee, I could do that, and give me a chance to act out like I did in high school. I did a lot of theater in high school, and I thought, gee, now I could be a reporter. That would be sort of something I'm not afraid to do, is speak in public. So I had basically on-the-job training, and I covered riots and demonstrations and anti-war stuff for about 2 years. And then my boss left Buffalo to start NPR. Bill Siemering, who wrote the papers that created NPR and was the first program director there and created All Things Considered. We had actually been practicing a show like that up in Buffalo before he left. And he went there, and I begged, borrowed, and screamed as I was graduating college that in the first year he finally allowed me to come to Washington and said, "You'll not be on the air." I said, "Why?" He said, I need entry-level people. I just hired somebody named Wertheimer and somebody named Stamberg, and they all come in as these entry-level people, and they're on the air. I need somebody who'll stay, behind the scenes doing the grunt work. I said, I'll do that. And so for the first 3 days, I did those sorts of grunt work things. And then the Washington Senators left town to go to Texas. And they needed somebody who knew about sports, and I was the guy, So I went out and covered the Washington Senators leaving, and I came back. And they still would not allow me to be on the air, but they allowed me to do something that you saw, if you saw the movie Broadcast News, where in the control room, there was a guy or a woman who asked the questions in the ear of the interviewer, and he asked the question. That's what I did. We used to interview a science reporter for the New York Daily News every week, and the moderator didn't know anything about science, but I did, so I would whisper the questions in his ear, and he'd ask the question, and the answer, and I'd do a follow-up in his ear, so I was virtually on the radio doing this, and after a while they realized how silly this was for me to not be doing this directly, so I worked my way on the air that way.
I have a feeling I should have someone here who knows science whispering in my ear, but I'll go with the flow. I was looking at the SciFi Blog.
Right.
March 8th, I think, was the one I looked at, and you reported a recent survey by the Pew Research Center that found that science and technology was one of the most popular online news topics. 44% of the sample, I was impressed with that number, wants to see more online coverage of science, scientific discovery, science news. Are there science stories today that you think have been underreported, that need more publicity?
Well, there are all kinds of science stories that are out there. And just to go back to that survey a bit, this is brand new, and this is the Pew people discovering that people like science. I mean, and what was interesting about this is they were discovering different ways that people get their news, and most of them now, second only to TV news, the internet has surpassed newspapers. And when they asked people in the survey, what kind of news are you not getting enough of, the top answer was science news. Mm-hmm. Right below that was religion and spirituality and all these other things you would think, but science news was at the top of their list. And I'm saying, wow, Mazel Tov, you just discovered this, We've been knowing this for 20, 30, 40 years. So that's what my blog was about. But in terms of things that are underreported, there are all kinds of interesting things you never hear about, because the news business is not in the news business anymore. The news business is in the entertainment business. All major news organizations, CBS, ABC, all these people are owned by entertainment people, so you don't get very much of the news about anything.
But you can make science entertaining.
Well, that's the whole point. That's the way you work backwards, is that the idea is if you're going to capture people, you're not going to just... I'll give you an example. One of the most famous things I did in the mid-'70s was I did a story on wintergreen lifesavers. I don't know if you have heard of this one. I was co-hosting the program. Susan Stamberg in the mid-'70s was on vacation. They asked me to co-host it. And I had a letter from a listener on my bulletin board for about a year. And it said something like this: I know you like to investigate science stories. Can you investigate this? My kids and their friends go into a closet together. And being a modern mother, I'm not sure I want to ask them what they're doing in the closet. But I did ask them one day, and they said, oh, nothing what you think that we're doing. We're in the closet chewing on wintergreen lifesavers because they spark in the dark. Can you look into that? So I waited like a year until I had an opportunity as the co-host of the show. And I said to Susan Stamberg that day in the story meeting in the morning, we're going to look into this thing about whether it really sparks in the dark and why, if it does. So I actually tried it out. I went into the bathroom together by myself and turned the lights out, put a lifesaver in my mouth, waited for my eyes to adjust, and chewed on it, and sure enough, a little green glow came out of the lifesaver. So I called up, I looked through my Rolodex of lifesavers. The company was in Greenwich, Connecticut, and I called them up and asked them if they knew about this, and they denied any knowledge of it. And if you sort of say anything, we're going to sue your tushy off on this thing. Whatever. I got the impression I shouldn't say anything. So I only had a few hours to research it because I was co-hosting it and I couldn't do my regular reporting job. But I said to Susan, at the end of the show, we're going to end the show in the closet, sparking these lifesavers, live on the air.
Gives a whole new meaning to the notion of sparking.
Exactly, exactly. And so we did that at the end of the show, and she said, do you know why this is? I said, I don't have enough time today, but I'm sure by tomorrow I will find out. And so by the next day, the phone was ringing off the hook. People giving me answers. Science teachers were saying, you know, Roger Bacon and Francis Bacon, they knew about this stuff 300 years ago. They wrote about it in papers. If you take sugar, it's a sugar molecule. In the old days, they had lumps of sugar in the cellar. And if you went into the cellar with a pick to break off a lump of sugar, it was in the dark, and you hit it, they would write papers about seeing this thing spark in the dark. We've known about this. It's called something triboluminescence. You break the molecule down, there's this big voltage that occurs, like static electricity, but you don't normally see it because it's in the ultraviolet range beyond your sight. But the wintergreen impurity in the sugar makes it fluoresce down a little bit into the visible range. And that's why you can see it. In fact, you can see it with the other flavors, also different color. So I went on the air with this, and for the next 10 years, there was more mail on this story than any other story that was done on all things everywhere.
Has lifesaver fatigue set in?
Well, no, I did Son of Lifesavers, I did his grandson, I did other ways. But the point I'm trying to make is if I had gone on the air that day and said, well, folks, today we're going to talk about triboluminescence. The dials would have clicked to Rush Limbaugh all over the dial somewhere, you know? But because I was able to make dramatize it in this way by going into the closet, this was the little hook to get people to think about it. And I would find other ways of dramatizing things on the radio, because on the radio, the pictures you create in your mind are better than anything you can see on television. So when we had a oil spill up Nantucket one year, and they described this soil and the sand and the oil globules and whatever, I said, let's create an oil spill in the studio. And I took a 10-gallon fish tank. I made salt water out of it. I spent the whole day looking for number 6 crude heating oil all around Washington. Got a couple of mason jars of it, stuck it in the water, and on the air we sloshed it around to see what an oil spill looked like and how it would clump to the sand like they said it is. So I learned that you had to be,
If this had been a TV program, what would you have done?
be called Newton's Apple. I went ahead years later in the 80s and hosted a TV show on PBS that basically did these things.
Did an oil spill?
We did an oil spill. We did everything that you can demonstrate how science works. I remember the first show I did was, how much do I weigh underwater? Well, how fat is Ira Flatow was the name of the show. And they talked about body mass and how to really figure out what your body mass is by getting weighed underwater, because fat floats. And the thinner you are, the more you weigh underwater.
And the thinner you are, the more likely you are to sink, right?
That's right. So the scale will weigh a little bit more.
So you wear your lifesaver.
I did. That's right. So I always thought that's where my talent with at least a little bit of showbiz came in handy. I had my lifesaver on and still around today.
Do you think high school students would learn more science if when they went into science class they simply listened to Science Friday?
I think if they did a lot of demonstrations, it would help.
Yeah.
I mean, there was another study out recently that informal science education is a very useful way to get kids to like science. For example, going to the museums where they show science demonstrations, taking field trips, things like that it does really work to get kids interested in science. What I think what's wrong with education, the way science is taught, is that we teach everybody to be scientists. We think everybody can be a scientist. We should also have classes that teach you why science is important. Who the great scientists were. Why were they interested? Why is Mendeleev interested in bees? Or why was he so interested in the periodic table? Why was Einstein interested in light? What motivated them? How they were just like you. There are things to wonder about. And if you teach science as a cultural event, I think people will be more interested to then pursue it and pay more attention.
Well, I agree. When I was a freshman in college, I took a course by Thomas Kuhn and Leonard Nash.
Yes.
Kuhn, I didn't know it at the time, I was, 18, was writing his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, but his course was extraordinary. When I got to graduate school, the book was out, and people were talking about it all the time, and I said, what else is new? I had this when I was a freshman in college.
Right. You should. I think there's a way to get kids interested in science that using examples of the world around us, and that's what we do, not just on our radio show on Science Friday, but we now make videos every week of how science works and how how scientists do what they do, and we put them on our website, and we promote them now every week as our video pick of the week, and we allow anybody to take the code and stick it on our own website.
And we've talked a little bit about the Pew study and the amount of interest, but within the broad field of science and technology, are there subtopics, sub-areas that are most likely to attract people's attention?
Yes, animals. Anything to do with animals, people love. In fact, when I did Newton's Apple, the first thing that the producer said, because the show Nature was on PBS and was wiping out all the other ratings, and they said, we have to have an animal segment no matter what we do, somewhere in the show. But people love to talk about animals, but what they also love to talk about is space. They love space. They love to talk. My favorite subject is talking about cosmology, which has to do with what is the universe made out of. I mean, to me, one of the most fascinating and mind-boggling and sobering things is that here we are in the 21st century, and we don't know what 96% of the universe is made out of. Everything that you see around you, everything, every planet, every star, everything that you can see, it all makes up only 4% of the universe. And there's some dark, strange matter and energy out there that we have no idea what it really is. It's 96% of the universe. How do we think we know about anything if we don't know what 96% of the universe is? And that's and I love to bring scientists on to talk about that, because the scientists who are very confident will tell you they don't know. The scientists who are not so confident will try to make up what they think it is.
Sound like undergraduates to me.
So to me, that's great. And stuff with nanotechnology, stuff with biology, these things don't get talked about very well on television or in the media, because they're not. It takes more than 30 seconds to explain these things.
Should more journalists be trained in science, not to be scientists, but to be good reporters of science, interpreters?
Well, if we can find jobs for them. There used to be lots of jobs for science reporters, and I think one of the questions that gets asked me quite often is, should you be a scientist who becomes a journalist, or a journalist who studies science? And I don't have a set answer for that. I think you could go in either way. But I think if you're a scientist who likes your topic that you're thinking of, that you're studying, whatever field it is, you can learn the tools to become a good journalist. You can learn that it's a craft, like being an artist. You have to have some talent at it, but you can learn that. It's harder to start out as a journalist and say, I'm going to get interested in biology now. You have to sort of have an innate interest in science to begin with, I think.
Would you put health in that set of science topics that attract interest?
Yes.
Or is health a wholly separate category?
Health is a very, you don't have to go on television or any other place in the media and convince people to cover a health story. But you have to convince them to cover other stories about physics or chemistry or other kinds of biological stories that take any kind of explanation. You have to convince them to do that. I once had a job at CBS, in the CBS morning show many years ago, back in the early 90s. And only because the producer liked science and had a good experience did he actually hire me for once every 2 weeks. That was enough, but at least I got on once every 2 weeks. And I was in his office one day, and I had been on for 6 weeks, and I thought he was going to fire me. And he came into the office, and he's hemming and hawing and talking about the weather. And I said, you want to ask me a question, don't you? He said, yeah. I said, I'll bet you I know what the question is. He said, yeah? How'd you know? I said, well, because I'm a science reporter, you want me to look like a science reporter. So when I'm doing my science stories, you want me to wear a white lab coat, don't you? And he looked at me and he said, how did you know that? I said, well, because I could tell there's a stereotype about science and science reporters that doesn't ever get carried over into the other disciplines. You think that we're just weird people. I said, I'll make you a deal. If the guy who does the stock market report wears a green eye shade, I'll wear the white lab coat. And he said, you know what you have on is just fine. And then a month later, it was very funny, a month later he was kicked upstairs to be Dan Rather's producer. And I said, I have to see this first show because I know he's going to look like a news anchor, you know. Sure enough, Dan Rather had a home makeover, you know, that first day because they wanted him to look like what he thought a news anchor should look like. But you still, we science journalists and science gets treated with a whole different attitude than all the other subjects. And I don't understand that because the public loves science. Mm-hmm. They'll take as much of it as you can give to them. But the gatekeepers, the trouble is trying to get past the gatekeepers. You know, even in my job that I do now, I mean, NPR tells me that if you want to stay on the air, you have to raise all your own money. I mean, I think this is an incredibly popular show. Well, if you want to stay on, we're not going to raise the money for you. You have to raise all your own money. So now I spend more time raising money than I do actually putting the show on the air.
But since it's such a popular topic, raising money shouldn't be a huge challenge.
Well, that means I have to hire a whole separate staff and spend all my time doing it.
No, I understand development.
Yeah. I mean, this is a change also over the years.
Well, let me pursue that a little bit. What are your criteria for selecting Science Friday topics?
Well, since we try to stay as a news program, we have 2 separate hours. We try to divide the hours up into the first hour, maybe more newsy, harder news items that are happening that week.
And you're doing genetic modification tomorrow.
Yes.
And our own
Yes.
Dick Sayer is going to be on the program.
Yes. But so in keeping with that, the second hour is a little more of a softer touch.
Missouri Caves.
The Missouri Caves. Missouri has 6,000 caves, in case you didn't know. You know, I don't know anything about the Statue of Liberty. I live in New York. But Missouri has 6,000 caves, and I know a lot about all those caves, and we're going to talk with cavers about why the caves are important and what kinds of things are attacking the health of the caves, like this disease that's killing bats in the east that is slowly making its way here. And so we divide that up, and on every Monday we have a story meeting to try to decide. We get to see all the science journals before they're published. So we have a head start on a Monday, and we can get to go through hundreds of different potential stories for that week and decide which ones are the most important. And there's a real problem in that, deciding, well, should we cover a story that no one's going to cover, which I think that's part of our mandate, is to find these stories that no one's going to cover, or should we cover a story that everybody's going to cover because we'll do it better than they're going to do it? You know, you're only going to get 4 seconds on the evening news that night, and you won't understand a thing of what they're saying. So sometimes we will wait till that first story is done and then try to redo it a little better.
And you're saying we. Are we talking 3 producers and you, or 5 producers and you?
We
and
have 6.
Consensus vote? You have a
The buck stops here. So yeah. I have a staff of about 6 producers. And you'll see most of them here. If you come to the program tomorrow, they'll be out there scurrying around. Very small staff, and we're very efficient and very dedicated. And we try to do the best job we can, and it's a lot of work.
Now, you said you get a look at a lot of science journals.
Yes.
I read an article the other day in The Economist about the information explosion, and one question is, how do you keep up?
Right.
And what about meetings? For example, the AAAS just met out in San Diego, I think. Do you look at their program to see what they're doing out there?
We were there.
Oh, you were there.
We covered. You weren't listening that week. We were out there. Actually, that's the one meeting that I've been going to the AAAS meeting since 1972. I think I may have missed 1 or 2. And we take the show on the road, that meeting, wherever it is, because it has a lot of interesting science going on there.
Did you come away with any story ideas?
Well, the AAAS, because they plan the meeting a year in advance, it's hard to come away with any hot news for something that's planned a year in advance. But it gives us a chance to talk in science and more science and policy issues, which I think are very, very important, because you're all paying for the science research that goes on in the country here, so you ought to know where your money's going and how it's being spent. So we talk about science and public policy issues and those, and then we get a chance to pick the brains of some of the great scientists. In the past, we're in our 10th year now, and we're trying to think of our 20th year, and what is a good 20th anniversary program or a set of programs that we could do. And I thought maybe we could pull out some classic moments of Science Friday, like Carl Sagan, and people who are not around anymore, some of the famous scientists. Sherwood Rowland, who first talked about global warming and ozone holes back when there was no such thing, and pull out some of these classic shows. So we think we'll pull out some of these voices that are no longer around. Well, we had Jane Goodall. This was one of the most interesting topics we had. Jane Goodall was on a few years ago, and we were running out of time. And a listener called up and said, Dr. Goodall, do you think there are other kinds of of primates out there yet to be discovered. And she said, oh yes, I think there really are. There's at least one that I'm thinking of. And they're having this conversation, and I sort of stopped it saying, I'm the third person on this conversation. Are you talking about what I think you are? Are you really talking about Yeti and Sasquatch? And she says, yeah. I really think that they exist, and now that we have DNA analysis and we have some fur and whatever, I'm not saying we have ever found one, but we should not close the possibility off that one exists because there's enough evidence to actually go look for them now. And she's continued to believe that, and I always tweak her with that question every time I interview her in the past 10 years.
You have a chapter on Goodall in your book, too, I think. But I have a question about Goodall, because which comes first, the person, the interviewer, the person who has a reputation, would be interesting, draw listeners,
right,
or the topic? Which do you pick
It depends
first?
on whether the topic or the person is more interesting. I believe that radio is a very personal medium. I mean, you bond to the person, you tune into a radio show because you're really tuning into the personalities that you want to hear.
Ira Flatow.
Oh, well, me or my listeners or the feeling of the show.
No,
There's
I
a
tune
certain
in to
feel-
listen to you.
Well, thank you. You're the only one, I think. Anyhow, so if I get a guy like Bob Ballard, who's been on a few times, the guy who discovered the Titanic, everybody knows him as the guy who discovered the Titanic, but let's talk to Bob Ballard as the guy who discovered all these other things and hardly even mention the Titanic. So we'll have him come on and talk about, he's the guy who discovered these giant tube worms at the bottom of the ocean. He's the guy who discovered this. All these discoveries he made. And oh, by the way, Bob, how did you ever get to the Titanic? Which is a great story in itself about how he was doing a military project, a secret project to discover a submarine for the Navy that had crashed decades ago. And he had done it so quickly that he had extra time with the equipment, meaning the ships. And he said to the Navy, can I borrow the ship for another 2 weeks? And they said, okay, and he went out and discovered the Titanic with it, Probably on taxpayer money, as far as I know, what it was. But so some of the personalities are so interesting, and they have such great lives, that I want my listeners to hear that these are not dry, boring people. They really think about great issues. They are passionate about what they do. So if I can bring those people on board, I can bring Oliver Sacks on to talk about what he does. And we had a really incredible Oliver Sacks moment. We had Oliver Sacks on a while back, and he heard that we were going to talk about the segment after him, where we're going to talk about discovering giant squid in the South Pacific. And he calls me up and says, do you know that is my favorite subject? I said, what, your favorite subject is giant squid? He says, can I sit in on that interview? I said, sure, you can ask the guy anything you want. I'll put my feet up, And sure enough, he shows up for the interview in New York with a giant squid T-shirt, he's got 2 rubber giant squids in his hands that he's squeezing. Who would have known this about Oliver Sacks' other interests? And then he let these things come out, and he sat through the interview. And I said, Dr. Sacks, you want to ask a question or two? And he said, sure. And he participated in an interview, and we got another facet of his personality. We love to hear these stories about rock stars and movie personalities and all these kinds of people in show business, but we never hear the other sides of the lives of people who are scientists. And there's actually a series I would like to create. You know how James Lipton does this actor's studio thing with actors? I would like to do an actor's studio thing with scientists. I'd like to sit up here on a stage with a very famous scientist, maybe you, and ask you about your life and other things that no one hears about.
Political science is not a science.
Oh, well, you must be in there with the economics people. So I think that people would like to hear the other sides of science.
Let me turn to some written questions and bring the audience in. You travel all over the world. What are some of the great science cities? Why, and how does St. Louis compare?
It doesn't match the South Pole, I'll have to say that. Close second. But I mean, the South, if it's a city or not, I think the South Pole, Antarctica, where I went to 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago now, was probably the most life-changing thing. My kids know it's life-changing because I never go in the car without an extra set of warm clothing anywhere. So if you've been to Antarctica, you understand it. Somebody's shaking his head. Yeah, you're always traveling with emergency clothing, and I learned how cruel nature is down there. You're allowed to make one mistake, but not 2. You can make the mistake of being stranded, but you better have your clothing with you, or that's mistake number 2. I think St. Louis really does have an opportunity to become, this plant capital of the country, because no one else is vying for that. And you have the resources here, you have the universities here, you have the housing here, you have the facilities here to do that kind of stuff. I mean, it's not going to compare with, with some of the old physics centers that they used to have in Germany in the first part of the 20th century, but you certainly have an opportunity here. And you got a great baseball team, so what else do you need?
I'm going to follow that question up, though, with the competition.
Okay.
Who's in a competition as a science center? We have an opportunity to be a great life science, plant science center. Who are we competing with?
Well, who you're competing with is a different industry. You're competing with Silicon Valley. These are other great centers of other kinds of science.
Mm-hmm.
If you can take that idea and move it here, but do it with plant science, you won't have any competition. Try to get those people who have that kind of sensibilities about doing what they do with transistors and have them do what they do with cells here. You're working on the same scale, then you have a great combination.
For the educated layman,
Right.
What's the most effective way to at least pretend to keep up with what's happening, to be more or less scientifically literate?
I would say find a couple of good websites that do good science journalism. And I would say, in the old days, I would say find a couple of journals that these are, like Science News, Science Magazine, and one British one that doesn't get much coverage in this country, but is an excellent journal for a little bit different way of thinking instead of American thinking, which is New Scientist. They've been around for a long, long time. And you'll get a foreigner's view of American science and what they think is important to cover. Because, what is left out of journalism is as important as what is included in the paper. Because everybody has to decide what they think is important, and that's a very subjective thing. And other people may have other ideas about what they think is important, and we should be listening to them also.
Here's one that's a new topic. My students have their noses buried in their laptop computers, usually playing games or checking Facebook. What do you feel is the impact of technology on learning? Is our brain capable of adjusting to this technological change?
I think, I don't know. I mean, maybe, we don't know where this is going to end up. Maybe they should be tweeting the students. Do you ever think a professor would send a tweet to all the students, pick your nose up and look at the board? Anyhow.
I saw an article in the Chronicle the other day. Some professors now are banning laptops from their classrooms, like getting cell phones out of cars.
Did you see the thing about the high-frequency cell phone pitch? Do you know about this one? Where people our age can't hear it, but the students know when the phone is ringing? My daughter showed this to me. I said, well, when is the phone on? She said, it's on now, Dad. I couldn't. So there is a technological problem with that. There are things that I really believe that things run in extremes, that the pendulums swing in very extreme situations, and that life works in cycles. And sometimes we go through this swinging pendulum, this extreme cycle. We may be in one now. The big bubble on Wall Street when it exploded, that was the end of an extreme cycle and things came back. Who knows where this digital age is going to lead us to? Maybe it will go to some place where we all decide this is just not working. That we have totally lost personal contact with each other. Kids don't get a suntan anymore. They have vitamin D deficiencies coming out on everybody because they're inside doing this all the time. Maybe I worry about 30 years from now, my kids are going to have arthritis of their thumbs. We're going to start seeing this in 30 years. When they're 30 years old, they have these tremendous arthritis problems from moving their thumbs all the time. So I think there will be a pendulum swing coming back in the other direction. I don't know what it is. I don't think we can ever predict where technology is going. I remember when I was a very young kid, I used to watch a 1947 RCA TV set with a screen this big, and now the screen is still this big, except it's on an iPhone,
No.
In 60 years, the screen hasn't changed in size, and this is still the cutting edge of technology. So it's hard to predict where any of this stuff is going to end up or what it's going to be. I
began by mentioning your book. It Here's a question from someone who's read your book. I really enjoyed your recent book. Do you have plans for another? If so, what's the topic?
People ask me that all the time about, do I have plans for another book? And I don't know what it is, but there are certain little things I have a little personal crusades about. And one of the topics in the book is about how airplanes fly. And how
the Bernoulli principle.
We've all been duped for 60 years about the Bernoulli principle. It has nothing to do with planes flying in the air. And it has a little bit to do about how the air flows over the curve of a wing. But there was a book, I was approached on this in 1973 when I was talking about it, I mentioned in the book, by a professor up in New England, and it's been on my mind all these years. And a guy wrote a book called Understanding Flight, in which he totally, he's a physicist and a flyer, and he totally debunks the Bernoulli principle. Because it doesn't explain why, if you look at a helicopter, you look at helicopter flight, and we did this on Newton's apple. We put a helicopter on a scale, a little model helicopter, and we weighed it. And it says 6 pounds on the scale. And then we rotated this thing up, and it lifted an inch off the scale, and the scale still registered 6 pounds. There's no helicopter on it. Where does Bernoulli ever explain that? Right? It doesn't. What it explains is Newton's 3 laws of motion. Air from the helicopter goes down, helicopter goes up. And the same thing happens in an airplane. The airplane wing pushes the air down to the ground and only goes over the top of the wing. That's the important part. And the plane goes up. Because you can't see, the plane is moving at up 200 miles an hour. It's not standing stationary like a helicopter. You really can't see it. So if I were to write another book, I kind of think about putting together all these myths that we take for granted as being true, that are really not true. And I think I could collect maybe a dozen of them. Start with the myth of why airplanes fly.
And the title would be, What You Know That Isn't So.
Oh, I'll write that down. All right, I'll license that name, okay, from you. I think, you know.
I see a microphone over here, so I think that means we're ready to take a few questions from the audience before quitting time.
You know, the books, while you're getting a question of books, the publishing industry has changed so much in the years that people don't want books written anymore. You know, book tours are very rare, and going out and publishing books, they just want them published on the internet. Yeah, there's a guy with a hand there and someone there. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there we go.
Hi, Ira. Is this on? Yeah, okay. I was wondering, a long-time fan, and the only time that I ever screwed up an experiment while listening to Science Friday was when you had Michael Behe on to debate about intelligent design. And you often, in very controversial topics, will have two sides. And
right.
When do you decide to do that, and how do you make the decision about what's controversial that needs to be discussed in an adversarial manner, and when is it just not worth dignifying the opposition who are not scientists?
I made a decision very early on in the creationism versus evolution story. I had done a lot of research on it, and when I discovered that the whole idea of intelligent design was I read the Wedge document. You read the Wedge document. The idea was to create a phony impression that there was a debate here. And that would wedge in, we could use that as a wedge to get into science and have a debate about intelligent design. So I said, well, if I create this debate, if I dignify the debate, they've won with the wedge. They've wedged in. So we decided that we would never really have a debate about whether intelligent design was real or not, but we would bring on people who were in the debate. In other words, we would bring on school board members and ask them why they don't want to teach evolution. Or we bring on Congress people and ask them why they're sponsoring this, or a school board, or school teachers, and whatever. So we did it in a way like that. You never want to have a 50-50, create an impression as a 50-50 split when you have one person here, when it's really like 1,001. And that's the same thing with global warming. You know, in the early days of global warming, we didn't want it to look like there was a 50-50 split, that there was something to the global warming controversy. But there was some science, valid science in this, so I really didn't want to ignore it. But that is the hardest part, is how do you decide how many people on one side and how many people on the other side? And I tried to be fair. It's hard to be objective, very hard to be objective, but can you be fair? Sometimes there are not two sides to a story.
And sometimes there are way more than two.
Sometimes there are, and that's even harder
Yeah.
to get that across, that science is a method. It's not an answer. It's a method of finding the truth, and it's a moving target that what we're talking about today may not be true the next day. And especially when you hear stories about health and breast cancer and whatever and treatments and stuff like this, how do you say, well, last week you heard this, and this week we're hearing this? You know, it's a hard thing to get across. Yes?
You mentioned some excellent scientific journals for keeping up with. What about websites?
Well, they all have websites now, which is what I meant, that they're saving money in printing costs, and I would go to those websites. The AAAS has a very good website for science news. These other science, you know, you can read Scientific American. It's a great website. You know, I kind of figure, I think of it as like movie reviewers sometimes. How do you choose a movie reviewer that you know? There's so many of them. This guy's bad, this one's great. You go to a movie and you watch the movie and you see what they reviewed and you say, you know, I think like that person. I'm going to listen to his or her review next time because I agreed with that movie. Well, it's the same thing with maybe finding websites. Think of your sensitivities and your sensibilities of who you might agree with and how much sense and objectivity they use, their critical thinking, and then you go back to that site again. But you can tell immediately, you know, the bias that comes out in a lot of these news things.
Yes, sir.
I had the pleasure last weekend of reading a bestseller on science that is just out, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks.
Great book.
And I'm interested in your impression of the book, and have you done stories on the topic?
If you don't know what the book is about, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is about a woman whose cells were immortalized. She was a HeLa cell. They stole cells from her body. And they've been using them, you know, they say 3 times the volume of the Empire State Building since then. This was, I think, number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list this week. And amazing. And it's because the author has found a way to humanize science and tell it in a way that people really will stay interested in it. I use the corollary to this of using storytelling as the Big Bang Theory on television. Have you seen the show, The Big Bang Theory? It's about a bunch of nerdy guys who were physicists, and they lived together, and it's on prime time on CBS at 9:30. I actually was a guest. I did a guest appearance, or Science Friday did a few months ago, where they wanted to have the character being interviewed on a talk show, and they thought, who else could that be but Science Friday? So we interviewed the guy, and it wasn't a real interview, on their show. He was making an appearance on Science Friday. And they happened to break the record for listeners, the viewers that week, but that's something else. But to have a show that talks, that's main characters are all these nerdy physicists, and their physics is real. They're talking about magnetic monopoles being discovered in instruments in the North Pole. And then they go to the North Pole in the show into a laboratory. And the most amazing of all amazing things I've probably heard in my whole career is that they mention the name of the National Science Foundation 3 times in a half an hour. I think in the whole history of television, going back 60 years, unless it's on PBS, you never heard that name in 60 years 3 times in one year. But it shows that if you do science and present it in the right way, people, even the lay public, general audience, will like to learn about it and will stay interested. So it's in the art of the storytelling.
Yes. We all know that science cures and is wonderful and everything else.
It's on.
Okay. Do you have any interest in scientists who can, and the reason this comes up is because I've been seeing a lot of documentaries of history of what the war, the atomic bombs, and the gas. Do you have any interest in your program of science that can also destroy, I guess is the question.
Yes, I'm very much interested in the history of science, and I look at those stories from a historical perspective and what really happened. And when we do the news today, we think that we know the truth of these things. I remember covering 3 Mile Island for the whole time it was happening, and we never had any idea what was happening there in all those 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Only later on did we find out what the truth is. We hear stories today about Toyotas going out of control. I'm sure when we go through this history of really the facts, we're going to find out most of these people just thought they were hitting the brake pedal. They were hitting the gas pedal. That's my own personal view of a lot of this stuff. But in terms of things, military science, yes. I really do think that there is a role and there's a place for us to talk about those kinds of stories. And I was very taken with a story that we had a few weeks ago with DARPA's balloon chase. You know about the 9 red balloons and how they had a contest? They gave away $10,000 or something. They hid in plain sight, I guess, 9 red balloons around the whole country, and they had a contest. Whoever can find them first wins the 10 grand, something like that. And it took a matter of just hours because people on the internet started tweeting and broadcasting and doing all kinds of things. Somehow, like a whole mass of people got together and cooperated through their friends to find these balloons. So this was DARPA that did this, a very dark agency. We don't know what they really do, and I interviewed the guy who did it. And now I hear that they have an energy version of this that the White House is just creating. EARPA, I think it's called. And there'll be some really interesting things. Maybe it'll speed up alternative energies. But we cannot avoid, the science and public policy issues like should you drop the bomb, other kinds of issues that really affect people's lives. And they're harder to cover, but they're, as I say, you're paying for it, for the research. You should know why it's happening. That's why I even talk to the crazies who call in on the radio, They're paying for it also. They deserve to be listened to a little bit,
I think we've come to our witching hour, but I want to thank you all again, and I certainly want to thank Ira Flatow for being such an exceptional conversationalist.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Can I just say one other thing?
Sure.
I have to say that we only get a chance to go, we can selectively pick out cities that we want to visit and stations that we want to visit. And we specifically chose St. Louis because we really enjoy coming to this city. And we really enjoy the science that goes on in the city. And we really enjoy your public radio station here and for their support. So we would not be on the air not for the support of this public radio station and other public radio stations like it. So as much as you can do about science, you need to support public radio people here also. It helps us. So my commercial, but it's actually true. It's I've been in this business 40 years. I've been in public radio 40 years. I knew Bob Edwards before he was Bob Edwards. And and even now more than ever, as the news business goes into the toilet, in general, we're going to see a morphing of the news business to be nonprofit. We're going to be seeing the nonprofit areas of public radio and public television to become more important to the news business than ever before in public venues. So it's the kinds of things that need to be supported.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
I'll close by saying, this is the perfect storm. If you're interested in science and in St. Louis, and many people understand the joy of the hunt, what is it like to walk on the moon or turn over a new rock? But scientists really aren't so good at communicating. And so, Ira, you do us a service. The NPR does us a service. And you actually all, this is your data about the 40% interested in science, of course, they were pre-selected to be bloggers. Well, this is a pre-selected audience of people who are genuinely dedicated to plant sciences, to the Science Center and NPR. And it is just a great moment, and I'm glad you've all been here. And let's have you back again if Pujols and the right kind of series comes together. I think we could get you back. Thank you.